A very good evening. My name is Seema Chishti and a very warm welcome to Express Adda, which is now conveniently shortened to E-Adda. We must thank all of you for joining us and our associate sponsor, SGT University. So frankly, the Express Adda was thought of as the very opposite of a lockdown. It is where we would unlock ideas, give ourselves food for thought, jostle about with people who are creative, imaginative, agents of change, who spur us to think and have made a difference to the world. So we've hosted sports persons, engineers, doctors, musicians, past presidents of India, ministers, authors, scientists, actors, wildlife specialists, and so on. But as we cannot all physically meet, we bring you E-Adda or the virtual Adda. This is the second in the series, where we hope to hear from thoughtful people on critical issues of life with and beyond coronavirus. We're privileged to have with us one of India's finest physicians and renowned pulmonologists, the director of All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Dr. Randeep Guleria. Very warm welcome, Dr. Guleria. He's closely involved in building strategies for prevention, containment, and management of COVID-19 in India. Dr. Guleria is part of the core team of top officials reviewing and monitoring the pandemic in the country. He heads the clinical research group of the National Task Force for COVID. He's also a member of the Empowered Group, constituted by the Government of India to track the availability of facilities and critical care training, and heads a team that runs the National Teleconsultation Center at AIIMS, connecting doctors across the country in real time for the treatment of COVID-19 patients. He has been the voice of moderation on public television, trying to calm fears as well as worry people enough to take proper precautions. So we have him with us today and are delighted that he would be able to answer our questions and show us a bit of the light forward in terms of science, rationality, and public health on the fairly grim road ahead. E-Adda is moderated by our political editor Ravish Tiwari and principal correspondent Konen Sharif. So may I request Ravish to take the floor, please.
Thank you, Seema, and welcome participants. So good to have you here, and I'll thank you, Dr. Guleria, for sparing time from his busy schedule for enlightening us for this pandemic. Dr. Guleria, I'll just jump, given an option if you want to start, make an opening remarks, or do you want us to start with a question?
So I could just make one or two things. The first thing that I'd like to say is thank you for having me over. And these are trying times for all of us. We are all living with a new normal. But I think it's also a challenging time and also a time for opportunity for us to see how we can improve things or handle things in a different manner. It's a time when there are a large number of people who are ill. There is significant mortality. Yet, we are working very hard in terms of research, in terms of other strategies to see how we could prevent deaths from happening and how we can have a cure as early as possible. So it's a challenging time, not something that one had thought of a few months ago that our life would go upside down in such a manner. But I think all of us need to really work as a team to see how we can come out of this pandemic that we're facing nowadays.
Okay, participants, just one reminder, if you have any questions, do key that into the question and answer chat bot, and I'll begin conversation with Dr. Guleria right away. Dr. Guleria, early in the disease, the 2020 started with the situation where economists were plotting epidemiological graph, and epidemiologists suggested measures like lockdown, which has an economic bearing, so to say. But I remember you had given an interview to Conan, and you had looked up. You had said that you had seen all the models, but you said that you will go by hard data that from the field will be generated. And now we have 40 days of lockdown. A lot of epidemiological clinical data has been generated. Now, with the benefit of last 40 days of lockdown data, what are the things that comforts you and things that still remains a worry for you?
So there is now a lot of data which has come not only from India but globally as to how this pandemic and how this new novel virus behaves. And I think it's something that we all need to look at critically because it's going to impact our life no matter what be our occupation or what we are sort of worried about, whether it be health or even non-health related issues. So the first thing is that what has become obvious from the data that emerged from China and from Europe and now from the US is that something like a lockdown or social distancing is something paramount if you want to flatten the curve. India did that early, and that is something that was a point of satisfaction, that we were very upfront when it came to international flights, when it came to the lockdown. And if we look at the number of cases in terms of other countries, we have a less steep rise, although the cases do continue to increase. So that is something which is satisfying because it hasn't really overwhelmed the healthcare facilities as it has done in many countries. And we all know that our healthcare facilities are already stretched to some extent. We are a resource limited country, but we've managed as of now to be able to not have ICUs or hospitals full of COVID patients as has happened in many Western countries. So that way it's a satisfying thing, but the challenging part is the future. What are we going to do subsequently, considering the population that we have, the fact that we have a varied number, depending on the socioeconomic status, from people living in what we call urban slums to the rural population, to crowded cities, people traveling in metros and the Mumbai rails. How are we going to handle that as we start lifting the lockdown? And how are we going to really make sure that this curve doesn't rise steeply as things sort of evolve over the next 6 to 8 weeks? Those are going to be crucial, because what we managed to do as of now is buy time to prepare ourselves. But we still are seeing a rise in number of cases. And therefore, we really need to be very cautious as we go in May and June.
Dr. Guleria, as a specialist and as a researcher, what do we know about the virus that offers some hope, and what remains unknown that makes the entire community still shooting the dark? There have been various studies and experiences from doctors globally who are perplexed with the variability of COVID-19 infection. The disease seems to wreak havoc not only to lungs, but also to kidney and heart and nervous system. So what is the evidence from India? Is the virus directly attacking these organs?
So we're learning more and more about the virus. Like you rightly said, it started off with 2 or 3 things that we initially thought, that the infection occurs only once you get symptomatic. And the initial data tend to suggest that once you have symptoms of fever, cough, cold, sore throat, body aches, then only are you infected. And that led to the whole strategy of isolating people and testing them when they had symptoms. Subsequent data suggested that this virus is actually more smart than what we thought. You can have a large number of individuals who are asymptomatic and still have the infection and still transmit the virus in the community without the person realizing that he has got symptoms. And that's why that strategy changed to everyone in the community wearing a mask. The other thing that we realized is that even in those who are symptomatic, you have what we call a pre-symptomatic stage in some individuals. That is, even before you become symptomatic, for the preceding 24 to 48 hours, you may still be transmitting the disease, and therefore you may still be causing the infection. Now, these factors are a cause of concern, because that means that the number of people who would be transmitting the disease in the community is much more than what you would pick up by just testing symptomatic individuals. That is one thing which is a cause of concern, and therefore your strategy has to change to more and more containment, lockdown, and making sure the hotspots are aggressively kept locked and no movement occurs from there, because it's not only people who are symptomatic, but asymptomatic people who would transmit the disease. The positive thing that we've been able to get in the last few weeks is, one is being able to improve our infrastructure in terms of planning, in terms of knowing that majority of individuals will recover and many just need oxygen with proper supportive treatment, and maybe just 3 to 5% will require the critical care or ventilatory support that is required. We've also learned that the younger age group people, by and large, tend to be safe and have mild illness. And if we need to focus our resources, we need to focus it on the elderly and in the high risk group who have associated comorbidities, because they are more prone to serious infection. We've also known that some drugs which are already available in the country may have some benefit, and that has led us to start using them, even though the evidence is still being generated. So we've tried to do that because we can't wait for the evidence. It will take maybe a year to do proper studies. And by the time we would have lost a lot of lives. So that has also helped us in trying to develop treatment strategies. And finally, of course, the whole community has come together in developing new drugs and also working together to get a vaccine out as early as possible.
And any evidence on the virus attacking these organs directly?
So, sorry, I forgot that part. So there is now evidence which is coming up that this virus not only affects the lungs, it causes a hypercoagulable state, that is cause clotting in the blood. It causes swelling of the blood vessels, what we call endothelitis, and therefore it causes involvement of the heart, what we call myocarditis. We've had a few patients who presented with stroke and subsequently developed respiratory symptoms and were diagnosed to have COVID positive. So this is now being reported even in the West, that you can have neurological manifestations in patients who are COVID positive. And we're realizing that even other organs like the kidney, or in some people there may be diarrhea, can also happen. So as we start seeing the entire spectrum of this viral infection, we're realizing that there can be many atypical presentation. In majority, it will be the respiratory involvement, but you can have some atypical presentation, and that's why you should have a high index of suspicion.
Dr. Guleria, there is one ballpark figure which I think most of my participants will be aware is the mortality rate. And there seems to be a wide variation, at least when compared to Western countries and India or in South Asia. There seems to be a huge difference. How do you explain, as a clinician, how do you see this pattern? Or is it that we are just waiting for that the counts are going to go up when we lift the lockdown?
So two things. One is that whatever data we have based on surveillance and based on testing does suggest that the mortality in India is lower than what has been seen in the Western world. And there are a lot of people who have sort of given various hypotheses for this. One being that our average age is younger, we are a younger population, and this causes higher mortality in the older age group. The other theory being put forward is that we've all had BCG vaccine, which is basically being shown in some studies to cause immunity, which helps against viral infections, and that may be protective. The other theory, of course, is that we are having recurrent infections and our immune system is already very active and therefore may be more tuned to dealing with the virus in a better manner. Some people have argued that maybe there's some mutation in the Indian strain, but we don't have data to support that. But I also feel that it's still, in my mind, we need to see how it evolves over the next 2 months. The number of cases are still increasing to some extent, and therefore it is important for us to be able to see how things evolve. As of now, we have a lower mortality, and I think it may be further lower because remember the denominator that we are looking at in calculating the mortality are those who are positive. And there are a large number of people who are asymptomatic, who also have the disease. We are not counting them. So if we count them, then the denominator will be much bigger and the actual mortality will be much lower. So I think overall the mortality is relatively low, but still it's a cause of concern, especially in the older age group and people with comorbidities, where there are a significant number of people who are dying, especially in the Western population.
Dr. Guleria, early in our response, there were two criticisms that the entire response strategy was under spotlight was the issue of community transmission, and the second was the way our testing protocols were set in. Were we hesitant or are we reluctant to admit the community transmission has happened? I mean, disease is now in more than 430 districts. Likewise, the testing protocols, was it only resource constrained or what was deciding our testing strategy then?
So coming to the testing first, I think it's important to remember that the testing strategy in a country like India has to be based on what question do we want to answer. What is it that we want to find out by doing the testing? When we started, the challenge was to see what are the cases that are coming from outside. This is a virus which came from outside. What are the cases that are positive among international travelers? And that's where the first testing strategy was. Second testing strategy then evolved that are we missing out some patients who come with what we call SARI, severe acute respiratory infection. And therefore the testing strategy was that all patients who are admitted with severe pneumonia need to be tested, and that was what was done. Along with that, we have another surveillance system known as IDSP, which is the Government of India surveillance system, which looks at cross districts, people being who have ILI, influenza-like illness, and people who get admitted because of severe acute respiratory illness like pneumonias. One kept looking at that data also to see for any red flags or anything which was different this year from last year. So we had surveillance data and you had lab data, which did not show a dramatic increase either in the number of cases of SARI or as far as the surveillance data was concerned. But as the pandemic progressed and as we had more and more cases, the testing strategy actually became more liberal. And now we're testing a lot of individuals with influenza-like illness, even in the hotspots. Our testing, which were maybe around 10,000 tests a day, is now close to 70,000, more than 70,000 tests a day. And hopefully by this weekend or early next week, we will actually be able to do 100,000 tests a day. So the number of tests that we're doing are almost equivalent to what is being done in the rest of the world. The only issue is that if you look at it on the basis of our population, it seems less because we are, the population of our country is much larger. But I think it's important to remember that this testing strategy has to be able to look at what you want to answer rather than just testing everyone who is presenting, because it would be a waste of resources. Regarding the question of community transmission, I think it's basically an issue of semantics. If you really look at various parts of the country, many districts are having very few cases and are having no case for 2 weeks or a month. So to say that there is community transmission in those areas is not actually a correct term, and therefore to say that community transmission is occurring all over India would not be a correct term. But you have hotspots where there is an issue of people who are being diagnosed and their close family members are becoming positive, and you're always worried that they may also be giving infection to other members in the community. So those are the areas where you need to be very, very vigilant, because those are areas where a number of people would be getting the infection because of the proximity that they have, whether it's a colony, whether it's people who are living together in an urban slum. And one needs to be very careful, because my concern is these hotspots, which we need to really focus on in terms of bringing down the number of cases.
Dr. Gulia, there's been a lot of information now on testing and recovery, but there's very little information, public information about syndromic surveillance of the infection, especially related to SARI patients or influenza-like symptoms. What has been the trend so far, and how important is syndromic surveillance in the future to track this infection?
So I think syndromic surveillance is very important, and I would say that in the cold spots or the areas which are not hotspots, the green zones, one will have to continue to do a syndromic surveillance, because you want to be sure that in those areas you're not missing out a cluster or an outbreak which may happen because of someone coming to that area, or COVID-19 coming to a cold spot, a green area, and that actually turning into an orange or a red zone. So there has to be a very active surveillance which has to be done at a district level, at a state level, and at a national level. The data has to be analyzed on our sort of live regularly. At the same time, one can also look at strategies for testing in these areas. You could do what is known as a pool testing, where number of samples could be pooled for people who have ILI, and you see whether any of them are positive. Because if they are negative, then you can say this is a non-COVID ILI, and this is an area where you're having influenza-like illnesses, but this is not COVID related, and therefore this area continues to be green. So there you will have to develop strategies both in terms of surveillance and in terms of making sure that the green zones remain green.
And any trends we have seen so far from the surveillance data?
So the trends that have come out from the surveillance data from these areas actually are pretty satisfying, because they don't really tend to point towards any increasing clusters or increasing numbers of ILI cases. And they've even, the IDSP has even compared that with last year's data to see that the number of cases, because it would vary, there's a seasonality or a seasonal variation also for ILI. So comparing the seasonal number of cases in each area which happened last year as compared to this year, there is really no signal which suggests that some areas are having a huge number of cases. And that is something which is satisfying. But like I said, we have to be very vigilant. The next few weeks are very important.
Dr. Guleria, the response, as we see at a national level, everybody is projecting India 40,000 cases, these many tests. But after 40 days, we can see that there are some places which is the disease has snowballed into a much bigger behemoth. So, as an administrator, as a health response, what is the metric that you use for the country's response? So do you say that the national curve is like this, and that does that satisfy you, or do you look at it as a state-wise variation, and how do you then fine-tune the strategy?
So you're right. One is looking at the national curve, but sometimes that can be misleading. So one will need to have a micro planning and a micro look, which could be state-wise, it could be district-wise, and see what is the number of cases that are happening on a weekly basis, and is there an increase in that? Is it also showing a downward or an upward trend? And I think you will also have to have different strategies when it comes to metros. Most of the hotspots or large number of hotspots are occurring in cities, and that's because of the general density of population and the fact that a large number of people who work there live in crowded facilities or live in houses where there is, one family, 5 members living in one room, or the migrant laborers are all living together, sharing the same kitchen or eating together, or there is a common toilet, things like that. So a different strategy will have to be evolved for metros and for areas which are showing increased number of cases. So there has to be micro planning also. You cannot just look at the curve from India as a whole. We are a very large country, and there are some states which have done well. Kerala is one example. And it's also worthwhile to look at what did they do which made the difference, and can that be sort of replicated in other areas where you still have an increasing number of cases.
Dr. Guleria, related to this question, what lessons that you prima facie can see that why different states have responded different? What infrastructure or what things that you see on the ground that gives you a learning that you will tell as the pandemic subside later that other states need to pick up?
So I think there has to be a lot of community participation and awareness among community, whether it's at a community level, whether it's community leaders, or or the health infrastructure. Because when we're looking at this illness, we have to prevent it, or prevent the number of cases from coming to the hospital. To do that, you have to have a lot of participation of citizens in terms of strictly following self-quarantine or home quarantine, or coming forward to get themselves tested. And if they're positive, going to a quarantine facility so that they don't spread the disease in the community. It needs also an aggressive action by the administration to make sure that this is implemented, and facilities are created to be able to implement it at the level that it is needed, because there are certain areas where the population is very large, the population density is very large, and you will have to create infrastructure or facilities to do that. That is also a challenge which different states are facing, and you have to be very aggressive in terms of your surveillance, in terms of monitoring, and in terms of developing such strategies.
Dr. Guleria, in the absence of a vaccination and a treatment, the virus is going to stay here for some time. Is it scientifically impossible for any region to have 0 cases of infection? And what is the strategy and what is the way forward?
So the ideal issue and the dream would be to have 0 cases, but I don't see that happening in the very near future. We will have to literally live with COVID-19 for quite some time, and we would have less number of cases, but one is very worried that we remain vigilant and not start relaxing our guard. The number of cases are still increasing every day. It's not that although we flattened the curve is still rising. It's not showing a decline in the number of cases. And that's why I said we need to focus a lot on these hotspots. But at the same time, the rise of the curve is not so sharp that we can't handle it as of now. So we need to keep preparing, develop strategies as far as the hotspot is concerned, and also realize the fact that when it comes to running our, let's say, coming back to our new normal, we will have to have strategies which will be able to work, or which we will have to develop with COVID-19 being around. So if whether it's travel, whether it's work, whether it's related to other things, it will have to be with COVID-19 being around.
Dr. Guleria, on the emerging approaches to deal with the virus, what are the options that offer you hope? One by one, let's go. The plasma treatment. What do we have right now?
So convalescent plasma is one form of therapy, and this is basically something that is not sort of new. It's been tried for many, many decades, even during the Spanish flu in 1918, and more recently in Ebola. What it basically is that you're taking the antibodies which have been formed in the blood of a person who's recovered. So he donates his blood, the plasma is taken, and we check that it has enough good antibodies. And that is given to a very sick patient because of the fact that these antibodies boost his immune system and helps him fight the infection. Now, there are two things in this. One is that this is one part of the overall treatment strategy. It's not that this is the only treatment strategy, but limited data, and there are two studies on COVID-19, one on 10 cases and the other on 5 cases, which tend to show that plasma therapy, along with the other treatment strategies, did have a benefit. But as I said, it's a complicated process. You need to have people who come forward to donate their blood. The blood has to be analyzed to see that it is safe and that it has enough antibodies, and then it is given to a sick person. So it's something that may help as an, let's say, an adjunct to the standard treatment policy, but I don't think we could say that this will be the only treatment that we will use, and therefore it's not the so-called magic bullet to really cure COVID-19.
And the drugs, we talk a lot on HCQ and now remdesivir. Can you brief us about what is on these two drugs?
So basically, hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine are drugs which were shown in vitro, that is lab data, and in animal studies to be useful both for COVID-19 and for the other coronaviruses, that is SARS and MERS coronavirus. Based on that, there was one study in France which showed some benefit in decreasing the viral load and some improvement. A study from China also showed some degree of benefit. But there are other studies which have not been able to show that much of a benefit as was shown in the Chinese or the French study. So we are not really very clear as to how effective it is. However, a detailed analysis was done of the available literature, and a risk-benefit sort of analysis was also done. Hydroxychloroquine is a drug which many of us have used for very, very long time, maybe more than 20 years, for a large number of illnesses, including things like rheumatoid arthritis, SLE, joint-related problems, lung-related problems, and have found it to be very safe, and people have taken it for many years without having significant side effects. So it was felt that the safety of the drug is good. You have to monitor for certain conditions, which we need to put up, and there has to be some degree of close monitoring by the health professionals. The evidence of its efficacy was questionable, but at the same time, it was felt that if we wait for the evidence, it will be too long and we may have a large number of people who may die. And therefore, a risk-benefit analysis suggested that hydroxychloroquine could be used, and that's why it was recommended by the ICMR. And it's now treatment for only two categories. One is healthcare workers who are actually managing COVID-19 patients, because they are the ones who are at a risk of getting the infection. And if we are able to decrease the viral load in them, it will help. And secondly, in close contacts of a COVID-19 positive patient. The other drug which has now come up is remdesivir. Remdesivir was basically a drug which was developed to treat Ebola. And it was tried but didn't do that well as a part of treatment for Ebola. It was also used firstly for one patient in the US as a sort of on a trial basis, and that patient recovered. Subsequently, there has been some data which again hasn't shown it to work very well. A recent study published in Lancet from China suggested that it tended to show that it did not have a mortality benefit. There was no benefit as far as survival was concerned, but it did show that the degree of the stay in hospital or the time to recovery was shortened to some extent by those who took remdesivir. Again, this is a drug which needs more studies or more details. But because of the fact that we don't have anything, the FDA gave this emergency use authorization to remdesivir. It has also allowed hydroxychloroquine to be used. And we need to have more studies. The WHO is conducting a large multinational trial known as a solidarity trial, in which one arm is giving remdesivir and the other arm is giving chloroquine, and the one arm is also giving an anti-HIV drug like lopinavir and ritonavir. So we will need to see data as it emerges as to the benefit. It's still early days, but still, as we don't have a definite therapy, it seems that trying something would be better than not having anything available. But it has to be done under close monitoring and as a research tool.
Dr. Guleria, as you said, I mean, all these approaches are work in progress. So it appears that we have to learn to live with it for the time being. So what is going to be the new normal for this? And particularly, let's focus on the health infrastructure. So even if a lockdown remains the way it is or get diluted or lifted, what is the new normal for the health infrastructure across the country?
So in my mind, is going to change very dramatically. Two things are going to happen, and it may be looked as an opportunity if you want to put it that way. One is the whole issue of what I would say is teleconsultation. And because of the fact that you're talking of social distancing and not having patients who are sick coming to the hospital, there would be a lot of push to have consultations which could be done either using your phone or through video conferencing, and being able to look at patients, advise them, and talk to them virtually rather than them having to come to the OPD. Now, some patients, we're doing this for some time, and some patients find this useful because they feel it saves them the time, the time of travel. At the same time, they don't have to wait for many hours outside the clinic or the OPD to get their appointment. It's done from their house, and therefore it's more comfortable to them. Especially the elderly and those who have chronic illnesses who just need advice on, let's say, a diabetic or adjusting his insulin dose, or a person who needs some advice on adjusting his blood pressure medicine. This type of consultation is something which would be useful rather than him having to come to the hospital and then wait there for a long period of time and also have the risk of getting infection. So one is teleconsultation will become something that will become a new normal. Secondly, there would be changes in how you examine patients and how we interact with them in terms of more and more infection control measures, social distancing while examining patients, wearing a mask while examining patients, and regularly washing your hands or wearing gloves will also become something which will be a norm. It will also for some time change how we go about doing surgeries, being extra careful in terms of infection control, and also in terms of how do we do procedures so that one would be able to protect healthcare workers in case someone has COVID-19. Remember, like we said in the beginning, many patients are asymptomatic. So you can't just go by looking at symptoms and saying that if you have symptoms, then only you would be taken up for a procedure, because the patient may be asymptomatic or maybe in the pre-symptomatic stage. And therefore, you will have to assume everyone is positive unless proved otherwise if you want to be protected and be safe. So there will be dramatic changes as far as the health and management strategies are concerned.
Dr. Guleria, another thing is that so far, most of the response has been led by the public sector. And if this battle is going to stretch for long, and given how the disease is concentrated in urban centers, and also a lot of tertiary care is with the private sector. I mean, what is the current mix of your response? The private sector doesn't appear to be as much in it. Is it by design, or what is it holding up, and what is the way ahead 2 months down the line?
So in my opinion, it needs to be a combination of private-public partnership. And the private sector has to come on board if you're going to really manage COVID-19. For various reasons, currently the private sector is not that active as is the public sector. The brunt of management, whether it be the COVID centers, the COVID care hospitals, is predominantly in the government sector. There are various private hospitals which have come forward and have had COVID hospitals, and I think that's a very good step. But a lot more needs to be done. Also, you must understand that this is causing a huge strain on the private sector because of the lockdown and because of the fact that patients are scared to come to hospital. A lot of routine work, which was what the private sectors were sort of running on, has come to a halt. Routine surgeries like, let's say, joint replacement surgery or angioplasty or bypass surgery or other routine surgeries, whether it is for hernia or for gallbladder or laparoscopic surgery, all have actually been postponed or come to a halt. And that is causing a huge strain on the private sector, both in terms of hospital admissions and the, let's say, the earnings that they have. And I think that is why they will have to be a lot of brainstorming and thought process as to how do we get everything back on track in terms of them being able to sustain themselves.
Dr. Guleria, you have been in this profession for long. You have been a health administrator. During the answer of this question, you mentioned there are a variety of reasons why they are not as much on board. Would you enlighten and also highlight the issues that can be tackled or a mechanism can be evolved?
So a lot of changes need to be done both in turning in a hospital into a COVID center. It's related with multiple factors. One, of course, is the fact that the patients would be reluctant to come to a hospital if it gets labeled as a COVID hospital for routine procedures. Secondly, of course, you will have to invest more. You have to get PPEs, which you are not getting. You will have to make different arrangements in terms of social distancing, the air conditioning and things like that. So a lot of structural changes also need to be done by the hospital, and it increases the cost that it has. Also, there has to be a willingness of all the healthcare workers to be actively involved in managing COVID-19 positive patients. Remember that if you look at the global data, a large number of healthcare workers have got infected with COVID-19, and we have had many people who are in the health profession and have lost their lives. So there is also a concern and fear as far as COVID-19 is concerned among the healthcare workers.
Dr. Guleria, I mean, time is running out before we open the floor for questions, but the two questions that I must ask before I open the floor. The one thing is that we have got last 40 days of data, the disease progression, clinical data, a lot of the health response has been informed by those data. For the next 15 days, 14 days, when this relaxed lockdown is enforced, there is more movement. What is the metric that you will be looking up during these 15 days that will inform your policy response post May 17? Which data point our readers at Express should keep looking up in our pages?
So I think the important is to look at how are both hotspots and cold spots behaving. Are the number of cases coming down, or we're not having more cold spots becoming orange spots? Second issue, of course, is to see what happens as the lockdown gets partially lifted in areas which it is being lifted in. Are there an increase in number of cases? Because here the movement will start. There will be people who will start moving. So what is that happening, and is the result encouraging enough to say that even after lifting the lockdown in these areas, we've been able to not have a spike in the number of cases? And we need to be very vigilant that there is no mixing or travel or movement of people from hot spots to the cold spots, because that will cause a huge concern. And that needs to be also monitored in a very sort of minute manner.
So does this long distance transfer of population that we have undertaken for last couple of days, does it worry you?
So there are two issues in this. One is the health issue, the other is the economic and the social issue. From the health point of view, if I was to really say something which would be ideal, would be that the lockdown should be that no one should move. That would be an ideal situation, and that's why the lockdown came in such a dramatic manner, because if we had said that people can move and then we have the lockdown, the very purpose of the lockdown would be lost. At the same time, the lockdown has been there for quite some time. It's causing a lot of hardships as far as the migrant workers, the laborers, and the daily wage people are concerned. And therefore, a strategy needs to be developed so that that is also looked at. At the same time, wherever they go, they will need to be quarantined, need to be monitored, so that we make sure that they are not giving the infection to the community that they do. And I think that is already being done both at a state and a district level to make sure that whatever migration happens or movement happens happens with these people or these individuals still being kept at least for 14 days in a quarantine facility?
Thank you, Doctor. I think it has been a good discussion. I think we should open the floor for questions from our audience, which I've been listening to very patiently. I think I've already got a few names and questions in the chat bot. I'll start with Mr. Arvind Paranjipe from Nehru Planetarium, Nehru Center.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Doctor, I have a couple of, first of all, you have a beautiful painting behind you. So if you can say something about that. But the question really is that if I was tested positive, go through a treatment, become negative, then is it possible for me to become positive again? Is my question.
Okay, so thank you for the painting. It's someone has gifted to me. It has a lot of medical things on it. It has a stethoscope and other things that are used by doctors. Regarding the question that you had, that if I think what you're trying to say, if you are positive and then you become all right, can you become again positive or can you have the illness again? So currently what we're able to see is that in large number of people, if they become COVID-19 positive and recover, they form antibodies in the blood, and these antibodies give some protection as far as subsequent infection is concerned. And that is why this whole concept of herd immunity is there. If a large number of people get these antibodies, then the number of people getting infected will gradually decline. What we really don't know is how strong is the antibody reaction and is it sustainable for a long period of time. This is a new virus and this is something which is not very clear. And what is also being seen is that in some people, the virus tends to stay for a much longer period in time. So you may be positive, the viral load becomes less, it may not be picked up, but you may still have the virus in your secretions, and later on, subsequent tests may actually show that you are positive and it may not have been eliminated from the initial time that you got the infection. But whatever data is emerging that there are people who develop antibodies, it does take time. It may take almost up to 3 weeks in some individuals to form antibodies. How long do they provide the so-called immunity passport is not very clear.
Yeah, so our next question is from Neelkhant Mishra. He's an equity strategist.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Guleria. Thank you very much for your very clear messages. I had a question regarding the granularity of control. So clearly, there is, we have gone to the district level now, but as we are finding in Delhi, we have seen areas where there is an industrial township, but just some in 2 or 3 infections and the whole township is shut down. At some point, if we have to live with the virus for this long, given that the 130 districts in the red zone add up to about half our GDP, we will have to go even more granular than that. And can that really be managed centrally? What are the mechanisms we can put in place so that we have more discretion given to district administrations without creating perverse incentives where they report low cases deliberately to keep the district open? And how much can central surveillance be raised so that those perverse incentives are controlled? Because otherwise, we may be shutting down a lot more of the economy than we need to.
Okay, I think this is a very important issue that you raised, and I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. I do agree with you that in certain areas, and this includes metros and cities, you have to have more granularity. You can't look at it from a district point of view, but you have to look at it from a local hotspot area and be able to see that what is the locality or the area where the cases are coming from, and work on a strategy of only being able to close that area and keep the other areas under close supervision, but allow them to function. Closing a large area out of panic will have a huge economic impact. And that granularity is already being looked at and developed for metros and cities. unlike the rural part where you could work on a district model. Also, you have a very valid point regarding the economy, and that is why we need to develop a strategy where we balance out running the industries and other things, but at the same time being taking precautions that it doesn't lead to a spike in number of cases. So different strategies need to be developed, and they have to be different for different areas in the country. We can't have one strategy for the entire country, and there has to be granularity when it comes to larger places like cities or industrial towns. I also agree with you that there has to be some degree of monitoring to make sure that the testing is done properly and there's sincerity with the people who are doing this or looking at this data and collecting this data, because being in the green zone gives you a lot of advantage as far as economy is concerned, but it also has the threat that if you call yourself a green zone when you're not actually a green zone, you can actually have a very serious health effect.
The next question, I think, May Thomas.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hi. So I have way too many questions for you, but I'll try to keep it really brief. One of the things that actually, I have like two questions that are kind of burning in my brain. One is that we know that COVID-19 is of the same family of viruses as SARS and MERS, right? Does this mean that the COVID-19, the coronavirus will continue to adapt and there'll be more variations of it? And how do we kind of prevent this from happening again?
Okay, so you're right. Both SARS and MERS belongs to the family of coronaviruses. These are the two major coronaviruses which have caused infection in humans. There have been other also coronaviruses which have had a mild illness as far as humans are concerned, but have never had a large fatality as compared to these two viruses. Viruses are known to adapt or mutate to some extent, and that is part of what they do. However, COVID-19 is a novel virus which is not linked in that manner to SARS or MERS coronavirus, although it belongs to the same family. It also has adapted itself. If you look at SARS for that matter, SARS was a virus which caused more of the lower respiratory tract infection. It caused more of pneumonia and we had a mortality of 10%. But it was not that effective in causing infection in the upper airways and therefore causing a large human-to-human spread. Same is true for MERS. MERS has a case fatality of around more than 30%, but it did not have the ability of, again, causing a large spread because it was not that infectious. COVID-19 has developed that ability to be more infectious and spread to a number of people as it comes in contact with. Doesn't cause that much of severe pneumonia, causes more of upper respiratory involvement, and you have mild or asymptomatic people also. So it behaves differently than what SARS or MERS behaved like. But that is also a problem because that is why the number of cases are so many, unlike what we have seen in SARS and MERS. But I do agree, we have to be very vigilant. The virus does adapt. After all, it is also trying to survive despite what we do. And viruses have been there for a very long time and they are known to adapt. But as we develop treatment strategies, they would be able to take care of the part of the virus which doesn't really change that much and would be effective even if the virus adapts to some extent.
Yeah. So our next question is from Jyoti Parekh. Jyoti, are you here?
Yeah.
I think while they connect, the next question we can take from Swati Piramal.
My question was, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, my question was, what is the policy for recovered COVID patients, especially in the healthcare setting? Should they be going back to work in hospitals, dialysis units, and others? Because we don't exactly know when they stop transmitting the virus. What is the responsibility of the employer if a patient has recovered, let's say it's a negative twice tested? How do you take them back, and are you sure that they won't infect other people? Do we have a clear policy on that?
Yes, we do. So there are two things to remember. What we are following is that if a person tests negative twice 24 hours apart after 14 days, then we ask him to home quarantine himself for another 14 days and then he can go back to work. Some people have argued in the West that these persons may actually be have some protective immunity and therefore may be better people who could go back to work. We're not sure about that. But the other thing to remember is that, and this is a lot of data which is now emerging, that even if you have a person who's asymptomatic or has mild symptom and recovers, he may have the RT-PCR which may show the virus, but the cultures don't usually show the virus after 14 days. And therefore, the chances of these patients, even if their swab is positive, of being infectious is very, very low. So I think if you have a swab which is negative twice, this person is, and the person is otherwise healthy, he could be able to go back to work and join his work. And that is being done not only for healthcare professionals, but even for people who are otherwise working in other areas besides the health industry.
Can we get Dr. Sansar Sharma of SGT University?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Guleria and Ravish, for being for the private sector. I am Dean of SGT Medical College, which is a private college. And in fact, we stood by the government for quarantine of the passengers from abroad. And then secondly, our hospital has been converted into COVID-19 hospital. Well, we have few patients. Now the government is pressing to start a treatment for non-COVID patients. As a dean, my challenges are that my question is to Dr. Guleria, to how to now begin with the treatment of these non-COVID patients. One. Second is the teaching of the students. Tomorrow the MBBS students will be joining the college. Then the lecture theatre we have got, say, for 150 students, we have a capacity of 200. That is that is according to Medical Council of India. Now then comes a question of social distancing. Then these are the challenges we are facing. Anything you can suggest about that?
Okay, so I agree with you that these are the challenges, and like I said, we will have to work with the new normal. As far as the COVID and non-COVID is concerned, if you are both a COVID and a non-COVID hospital, it's better to have two different blocks or two different areas which are well segregated for COVID positive patients and for non-COVID patients. The challenge that we have, and I'm sure you would also have, is that your strength as far as human resources is concerned will get split into those who would be involved in managing COVID patients as a COVID center, and you will have to have some people who will manage patients who come in the non-COVID area, but they would be restricted because of the fact that your human resources will get divided. But you will have to develop strategies for that. We are also doing that, trying to see how we can do limited care for the non-COVID patients. And like I mentioned in the beginning, one way that we are doing that is by using teleconsultation, trying to reach out to our patients, both new and old, by giving them appointments through our teleconsultation centers and thereby calling them up and able to consult them. If they need to physically come, then we give them an appointment and using a staggered system, give them the appointment so that there's not crowding in the OPD area. The second question about teaching, again, this is a big challenge, and therefore there is now the whole concept of virtual classrooms. You will have to focus more on teaching students by using the webinars or mechanisms which could be useful without the crowding in the lecture theatres. Some colleges are looking at splitting the timing and having students coming in batches, morning and evening shift sort of, so that those classes where physically they have to be present, it's done in a smaller number. It's more difficult to do that, but that is the other strategy which some colleges are looking at. There is also this issue of trying to see how much you can teach, which is virtual, and how much you need to for them to be physically present. But like I said, we will have to develop strategies for the next few months or years, considering the fact that social distancing is going to be a norm.
Yeah. So our next question is from Jyoti Parekh.
Yeah, she's in.
Hello.
Yes, you can go ahead, Jyoti.
Yeah. So can you describe, say if you are doing any modeling exercises, and what is the longer term vision also for the healthcare system of this country? In the electricity and water system, since 1980, we are trying to connect all households, and finally, at least in electricity, we have succeeded to reach up to 90-95%. And similar efforts can be done in healthcare system, where through local healthcare centers and nursing homes, and the whole institutional architecture has to be seamlessly developed. So is there any thoughts on one would start thinking about this? And would this return as again and again subsequent years? Do you see that? So 3 questions.
Okay, so the first one was regarding the health scare, and there is a lot of modeling that is being done, both in terms of how the cases are evolving and when we may have a peak, and what would be the capacity that we need both for human resources and for hospitals and for ICU beds. So that modeling data is being done. There's a whole team which is doing that, and there are multiple other experts which are developing different modeling mechanisms. And there is also this whole issue that is being discussed by various experts, including the Medical Council of India, as to what can they do, whether it's education or what can be done in improving the health infrastructure, taking this as an opportunity where the focus is on how do we develop a better infrastructure as far as health is concerned, both in rural area and in the tertiary or the hospitals, and can we develop a mechanism of connectivity, whether it's through referrals, whether it's through e-consultations, or and so that our system becomes robust as has happened in the past. In many countries, it took some dramatic thing to happen for the health system to improve dramatically. In the UK, the NHS, which is now a very good health system, actually evolved after the Second World War, and that became now a standard system as far as healthcare for the citizens of the country is concerned. So a lot of people are looking at mechanisms that can be developed as far as the health structure is concerned. Thirdly, regarding the virus coming back again, we're not very clear. There is this concern that the virus may come back in winter, and we may have another spike, either a second wave as it's called, and people are looking at that and worrying about that. I'll just try and give you a small example of another pandemic, which is supposed to be the biggest pandemic that mankind has ever faced. And that was Spanish flu, which happened in 1918. And if you go back and see the history at that point in time, what we're doing today was what was done at that point in time. There was colleges were closed, schools were closed. You could go back and see the papers at that point in time. There was social distancing. Stadiums were converted into halls, and there was people were kept 1 meter apart. Everyone wore masks, including the policemen. And there was a huge number of deaths at that point in time. In India itself, as per the data from the registry at that point in time, 7 million people died in 1918 pandemic. But the issue is that from there we have made a lot of progress. And the reason why I'm trying to say this is that the death occurred more in the second wave. there was a lockdown and people really followed that lockdown very well. But after the lockdown was lifted, they started going back to normal. There was no social distancing. People kept celebrating the fact that they're now out and started partying without realizing the problem. And that led to a huge second wave with higher mortality. So I think we have to learn from history and from the past. And as it evolves over the next few months, social distancing and being careful is something we will have to do. Taking care of the elderly, making sure that they are protected, are steps that we will have to follow for many months to come. And we should not look at this as a short-term battle, but as a long-term battle which may last even a year or two. The pandemic in 1918 lasted for 2 years.
Can we get Yogender Alakh?
Yeah, use it.
Dr. Guleria, I really enjoyed your talk. And before I ask my questions, being an Ahmedabadi, if you have any advice for us, we would be really benefiting from it. I have two questions. One is that I'm sure you are in the empowered groups that you are there. You are sending medical assistance and personnel and equipment to the for curing the disease the way it is right now in as efficient a manner as possible. There is another question that I have, which is that it has been said that the preventive aspect is also very important as compared to the curative aspect. I'm wondering whether any thought is being given to it. I think some of your comments suggest that it is being thought of. There have been models earlier in Gujarat itself. We have had Dr. Anil Patel, who was in Southall, and developed models of averting spread of some of these diseases in Adivasi areas in Mangrol Taluka. We have also had other experiments. Sehat, the NGO, had an experiment of community health. So if we are concentrating on the community aspect also, particularly in this case when people tend to live together in slums and so on, then what is roughly the share of resources that you will give to the curative aspect and to the preventive aspect? And if the preventive aspect is important, will you also worry about things like poverty? Because we do know that slums are very strongly related with urban poverty questions. Thank you, sir, and I really enjoyed your webinar.
Thank you very much, and I think you raised very important questions. First of all, I think the most important strategy continues to be preventive strategy. If we have to put our money somewhere, it has to be in preventive strategy. We don't have a definite treatment. Whatever treatment that is being shown has very marginal or minimum or mild benefit. Those patients who have severe illness, actually, even in the who are on ventilator in the ICU, even if you look at data from the West, the mortality is as high as 70%. So the focus has to be on preventive strategy. And the preventive strategy focuses on two broad pillars. One is the non-pharmacological approach, which is without any medication, and that is basically looking at social distancing, cough etiquettes, hand washing, and also wearing a mask. And to all of that, the thing that you added is the whole issue of socioeconomic status. How do you get this implemented in an urban slum or in an area where there is already poverty and people are crowded together because of the socioeconomic status or the fact that they can't afford to really have social distancing as we are trying to impose upon them. So I think that is the challenge, and that is why there is a need to have citizen participation, interaction with the citizens and with the local, let's say, community workers or the community opinion leaders to see how we can develop strategies where these people can be provided some degree of support which will help in developing or propagating these non-pharmacological strategies. Whether we have to have halls, whether we have to have some big stadium which can be looked at for some time where they can stay with good degree of social distancing. These solutions will have to be thought of because it's going to be a huge challenge, especially for people who are in the lower socioeconomic status. And poverty is one strong link as far as that is concerned. The second pillar which we need to focus on is vaccine. Vaccine is also a preventive strategy, which is the pharmacological strategy. And we need to put a lot of research, work aggressively. And I know a lot of Indian companies are working not only on their own, but collaborating with international researchers to develop a vaccine as early as possible. Because if we are able to have an effective and safe vaccine, and we can produce it in large numbers, then again, we will be able to prevent the infection in a large number of people by vaccinating them. So that is something which is very important. The third thing which I feel is important, and this is linked to the non-pharmacological management, is protecting the high-risk groups. So whether we are in, let's say, a city or in the lower socioeconomic status or in the rural part, we know that people with comorbidities and people who are elderly are at a higher risk of having more severe illness, and they are the ones who will cause the increase in mortality. So we need to work aggressively on protecting them, not letting them get the infection till such time that we have a definite treatment or we have a vaccine. If there is infection among the younger population, the mortality is much lower. So therefore, I think the strategy has to be based on non-pharmacological means, and we have to see how we can practically implement them and hopefully try and get a vaccine as early as possible.
Our next question is from Devesh Mundra from Narayan Health.
Yeah.
Yeah, Devesh, go ahead.
Yeah, sir, good evening. As the chair of the clinical research group, the immediate priority was to establish the COVID India Clinical Research Collaborative Network. So this is the first part of my question. What is the status on that? And the second part of the question is, one of the TORs, terms of reference for your clinical research group, was to identify partners for implementation. Could you share how many partners and who are the partners identified for implementation?
So, important questions. One is, of course, the network is already being established. It is also being established looking at the research question that you want to answer. There are 3 or 4 research priorities that India has which are specific to India. One, of course, is to look at is there a role of giving convalescent plasma? And a network of various institutes has been formed. There are more than 22 institutes which are part of that network in terms of the convalescent plasma treatment. There's also a strategy of developing a registry, and many institutes are coming on board as far as that is concerned. We are giving hydroxychloroquine, and there is a need to see how useful it is. A group is also being developed to look at the utility of BCG vaccination, because there is some data which suggests that may be useful. So the focus is to look at groups which are having areas that they can work on, where they are having scientific basis for that, and also to look at groups which are doing a lot of basic research and they can collaborate with the clinical partners. Remember, we have to do these projects of collaboration in the network in areas where there are available cases or the material is available for us to do research in. So based on that, the network has been developed, and a large number of projects, research projects are being rolled out. The challenge for us is to try and get results early, because many of these projects will take a few months to get a statistically significant number in terms of the sample size. And we're trying to see how we can shorten that or do some interim analysis to be able to get results in quickly, which can have bearing on our treatment as of now, whether we need to give BCG vaccine, whether we need to continue with hydroxychloroquine, or whether convalescent plasma is a good form of treatment in our country. So these are important questions which have clinical bearing and management in both in terms of cure and in terms of decreasing the mortality. The group is trying aggressively to develop these type of research groups. And I'm hopeful that we should be able to get the answers to some of these answers in the next few months.
I can see that there are a lot of questions coming in. I will request those asking questions to just limit their question to one, because I want to accommodate as many people as possible. May I request Jagdish Valavalkar of Ideal Education?
Yeah.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello. Is it possible to hear?
Yes, yes.
See, you said the virus is going to stay here for some more time. Can you estimate, pessimist level, how much time it will take? And another question is that when it will come back, is it likely? That I think you answered that it may come back in the winter.
So how long the virus is going to stay is a question everyone wants to know. It's a tough question. If we go by previous data, then SARS came and went quickly. MERS coronavirus seems will take a longer period of time. And I don't see it going away very quickly over the next few months. Some people who are optimistic say that it may go away by September, October. I feel that we have to be sort of wary and be ready for another wave which may come in the winter months unless we are very careful. But it's very difficult to really predict. It's a novel virus, how it will behave and how the temperature and the humidity of our country will affect it is something that we need to see over the next few weeks or months.
The next question is from P. Krishnamurthy.
Yeah.
Krishnamurthy?
I think we can go to the next.
Can I go to the next one?
Yes, we should.
May I ask Amy Kazmin?
Can you repeat, please?
Amy Kazmin?
Unmute. Okay, there. Unmute. Hi. Can you hear me now, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, good evening. I'm Amy Kasman from the Financial Times. I'd like to ask you, you said that the next 6 to 8 weeks will be really critical because, as you pointed out, India has not been able to push the curve into a downturn even under the most stringent lockdown that it's had over the last 6 weeks. So I would like to ask you what steps you think that the government needs to take in order to make sure that the curve doesn't shoot up steeply and steepen as the lockdown eases, and what, if in any way, the strategy, either in terms of testing or containment or both and other things, also needs to change. Because if you couldn't push the curve into a down direction under strict lockdown, what reason is there to think that it won't steepen significantly as lockdown eases? And second question is just if you could talk about the readiness of the healthcare system now compared to what it was in late March before the lockdown was imposed. Thank you.
Okay, so two important questions. One is the fact that the lockdown has helped in flattening the curve, but the curve has not shown a downward trend. And that is a cause of concern. And that's why I said the next 4 to 6 weeks are going to be very, very important because the lockdown can't be there forever. So the solution there is to identify those areas where the maximum number of cases are coming, the so-called hotspots, work aggressively in these areas in terms of containment, in terms of identifying and doing more testing in these areas, and thereby being able to try and bring down the number of cases in these hotspots and gradually try and convert them to orange or green spots. And that is the strategy which the government is following. At the same time, continue a good surveillance in the green zones or the cold areas so that they don't have a spurt of cases. And you have to be sure or make sure that there is restricted movement or no movement from a red zone to the other zones itself. That needs to be done, and that I think is something that is required. What the lockdown has done and what it has helped us in is exactly what you said, preparing as far as the health facilities are concerned. It gave us time because the number of cases did not rise sharply, or there was no steep rise in the last few weeks. And because of that, the health infrastructure could be made more robust. We could have COVID hospitals, COVID care centers, COVID ICUs. We could do a lot of training for health professionals to management, for infection control. We were able to look at providing oxygen and ventilatory support even up to a district level. And we developed strategies of how to advise doctors by developing various means. We at AIIMS have a facility which you mentioned as Connect, by which our critical care specialists can actually talk to doctors at a district level and guide them in the ventilatory management of these very sick patients if they do come to a district hospital. So it has given us time to prepare, and we are better prepared than what we were before the lockdown or in the early stages of the lockdown. The challenge, of course, is to see how we perform once the cases start increasing. But I do agree that the curve is still not showing a downward trend. It is still on a rising trend, and that we need to monitor very closely over the next few weeks.
Can I get Avantika Ghosh?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. Dr. Guleria, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. Dr. Guleria, you mentioned that we need to learn to live with this virus. We need to learn to go to work with this virus, if I remember your words correctly. So my question, sir, is that while we seem to have managed to flatten the curve, did we, through the lockdown, kind of delay that learning curve? Because today we see all this jostling in the alcohol shops. Even on the day of the Janta curfew, when at 5 p.m., when people were supposed to laud healthcare workers, people started coming out on the roads and crowding and everything. So essentially the behavior change communication that had to happen seems to have been taken over by this lockdown, sometimes use of police force. Do you see that happening, that being a problem as we ease the lockdown?
So I think that is the biggest challenge that we have right now. As you rightly said, we've been able to keep the curve flat, but it's not something that we can do for long. And the other issue is that the lockdown cannot be indefinite. So as I had mentioned, we will have to accept that COVID-19 is there to stay, and we can't wait for it to really go away and then lift the lockdown. So we will have to develop strategies to live with it. But having said that, we have to really work aggressively on looking at how we can get community participation in trying to do whatever we are saying at a very micro level, so that social distancing and the responsibility of each citizen is understood by him. Whether it's the fact that if he goes to a crowded area, he can give the infection to others, or he can get the infection and bring it to his family members and give it to some of his parents or an elderly in the family, and they can succumb to the illness. It can be fatal for them. That type of understanding still needs to be there, and at the same time, we need to balance it with the, let's say, economic needs of the individual also. So it's a big challenge for a country where we need to look at how do we implement this new normal of social distancing, of travel with this distancing in place, and also look at the economic side of this entire story, so that we are able to do that in a proper manner and not have an increasing number of cases, yet try and decrease the hardship on the citizens as much as possible. The solution, in my mind, lies in communication and education and getting aggressive community participation. Everyone has to realize his responsibility. This is a war which has to be fought at community level. It cannot be fought at a hospital level.
Can I get Dr. S.T. Ramachandra? Is there trouble? Then can we ask Sanjay Chandar. Is taking long. Should we call Rohit Sabdhani? Dr. Guleria, there's one question. I'll pick it from Avantika's question that we.
Yes, I want to ask.
So Rohit is there.
Oh, you have got it. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Well, I will just limit myself to one question which seems to be very important to me. It is, why is the use of HCQ is limited to just 2 categories of patients? Why not everyone? If a healthcare worker from benefit from it, so can I. Doesn't it violate my right to have access to a life-saving drug? Or is it linked to scarcity of drug in India? Thank you.
Okay, I think I missed part of your question, but you're saying why is HCQ not available to everyone? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, Doctor.
So I think the important issue to remember here is that when we advise any one individual to take a drug, we have to make sure that it is safe and we don't land up with someone having a serious side effect or it causing toxicity. And we have to be sure that this drug is effective. Now, both of these things are the cause of concern because this is a drug which is still not proved in clinical trials to be effective as far as COVID-19 is concerned. That is why the group that it is being given are those who can closely and we also put out what are the contraindications for using the drug. Remember, you may be the elderly or other people who may be taking other drugs which are also cardiac toxic or can cause arrhythmias. Hydroxychloroquine, if added to that, leads to a higher chance of an irregular heartbeat, and that can actually at times be very serious. So because of that, one is a little cautious, and that is why we are not giving it for everyone. The drug is made by a lot of Indian companies, so there is really not much of a shortage as far as the drug is concerned, but it's a safety issue that is driving the current guidelines. If we are able to say comfortably that it may work and it is safe to a larger group, one could change the strategy as we get more and more data. And we're doing what is known as pharmacovigilance, collecting data among healthcare workers to see that in these normal individuals, is it causing any serious side effects?
Dr. Guleria, one of the questions that has come to us is regarding the antibody testing. ICMR has given various press conferences on the antibody testing, but we really have not started. Can you just tell us the controversy why we not be able to, start the antibody testing?
Okay, so I think it's important to understand what is the utility of antibody testing. Antibody testing is not a test which can diagnose that, or not a good diagnostic test. If you have COVID-19 infection, the first test or the test which is actually the gold standard is your nasal or throat swab, where it is tested for the virus by RT-PCR. Now, if you get the infection, after some time, the body's immune system starts reacting and fights the infection by forming antibodies. These antibodies vary and take days to develop. So what we are finding is that these antibodies may take up to 10 days to 2 weeks to be developed in an individual. So it's no point in having a test which gives you a diagnosis after 10 days to 14 days, because by that time, the person has already got the infection, maybe recovering, or has given the infection to a large number of people. So the utility of antibody testing as a diagnostic tool is very, very limited. The utility of the test is more towards surveillance. Suppose I want to find that in a hotspot, how many people got the infection and have recovered from it. Let's say I want to see that now these are people who were asymptomatic sufferers and became all right. So I can then do the antibody testing in a large population to see how many of them have antibodies and thereby have got the infection without knowing it and have recovered from it. So it's a good surveillance tool. It's not a diagnostic tool. And that is why it will not work if you start using it for diagnosis. And if you look at previous data of antibody testing tools for viral infection, whether it be H1N1, whether it be SARS or MERS coronavirus, they really haven't performed well in terms of picking up the antibodies in clinical studies.
Dr. Guleria, one thing as we come to the last leg, the one question is about what is the post-COVID world is going to look like. So there has been protocols on how the workplaces need to organize, how hospitals need to organize, but there are many places which are public places. So let's say a railway station or an airport or an election rally. I mean, these things are essential for a normal economic life of the country. So how is that look like to you sitting, watching the entire thing develop from the top, the post-COVID public spaces?
So these are going to be huge challenges, and I also feel that this is going to have a huge effect on various, let's say, industries, whether it be the hospitality industry, whether it be the entertainment industry, or the other airlines for that matter. How do we really travel with social distancing? Do we therefore leave some seats empty as compulsory? And if we do that, how do airlines actually make a profit? Or how do they actually operationalize themselves? How do we sit in buses and trains with social distancing? Is just wearing a mask good enough as far as traveling is concerned? Or do you have to have empty seats in between? These are challenges which we will face over the next few months. Similarly, is running about restaurants or let's say shopping malls. How do we have people going there, or are shopping malls something that will not function for months to come? So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of developing a new normal and seeing how that new normal is practical so that we can live as far as our day-to-day activities are concerned, and the economy can grow as it should, considering these restrictions that are there. So there has to be a balance that has to be developed, and one has to look at strategies which are doable, practical, and safe. So there needs to be a lot of brainstorming which needs to be done. I think that's being done not only here, but at a global level.
I would like to bring this session to an end. I would like to thank Dr. Guleria for your time. You have been very busy, but you've been generous with your time for us. Thank you very much. I'm sure that most of our participants have benefited from your experience. And along with, I'd also like to thank SGT University, which is our associate partner, and thank everyone, every participant who joined here. I know there were several questions. More than 150 questions that were coming in, streaming in. I could not accommodate all of them, but I think most of those questions have been answered in one way or the other by Dr. Guleria. Thank you very much, Dr. Guleria.
Thank you very much for having me.